I'm Katie Meador-Stover. I'm the Director of Reader Services, and Blackwater Rising is Attica Locke's first novel, and hopefully not the last. That's going to be the first question I ask when she's done speaking for this evening. This novel I read when it first came out, and I found it to be a deft blend of mystery, politics, racism, loyalty, family, and friendship. It was shortlisted for an Orange Prize. It was nominated for an Edgar Award, and it was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award. This was one impressive debut literary thriller. And if you like complex legal thrillers like Scott Turow, then you will like Blackwater Rising. And if you like and appreciate realistically flawed characters of Dennis Lehane, then you will like Blackwater Rising. And you know what? If you just like a crackling good story, then you will like Attica Locke. And she's here to speak with us tonight.
Hello. Hi there. Thank you, guys. Thank you. I'm just going to start by saying I could not be more honored to be here. This is one of my favorite cities in the country. And being a Texan, I say that Kansas City is the Austin of Missouri. I just think that this place is very laid back and has great music and great food, and it is an absolute honor to be here. So thank you, first of all, for that. So what I'm going to do, I think, today is talk a little bit about where this book came from, my kind of point of view with my writing, but then also I'm going to read some portions in the book. I'm going to read from the first chapter and some pieces from the main character's past. And I'll start by saying that I am a writer who is tremendously interested in times of transition. This book is set in 1981 in Houston, Texas. The gentleman character who's at the center of it is a small-time criminal defense attorney named Jay Porter, who was heavily involved in the civil rights movement in the late 60s and early 70s, and now finds himself at the dawn of the Reagan era, and is trying to somehow psychologically navigate that. I was born in 1974, and I am a child of a political activist who went on to become a small-time criminal defense attorney who was trying to navigate the Reagan 80s. My dad was on trial in 1970 for some trumped-up charges of inciting a riot for a march that he did. And my mom, both my parents were really, really involved, but when I came along, by the time I came along, this was a part of their past that they didn't talk about very much. I knew it, but they didn't really get into the details of it, and yet there was a sense, for me at least, that I always had this sense that I was kind of raised in a lot of melancholy, that I knew that there was something else there that wasn't being spoken about. I'm 38 now. I have to say that when I was a child, when I used to look at pictures of my parents, and I would look at newspaper clippings of marches and shots of the courthouse, and would hear all these stories about the things that they were doing, I used to think that they were heroes. And it's only now, at my age now, that I can look at those same photos and think, oh my God, they were children. You know, they were just so young. And I have a much better understanding of what it must have been like to turn your life over to something that you deeply believed in, have it fall short, and then now you need to go on with the rest of your middle-class life. My parents were and are extraordinarily bright and resourceful people, and so they basically had 2 kids to raise. They had kids to put through school. They put on a suit, they dropped the dashiki, and they put on a suit, and my mom got her Ann Taylor outfit, and they got a Volvo, and they did what they had to do to raise their kids. But there was this thing that was sitting underneath everything. And so part of writing this book, I think, for me, was an attempt to understand the people who raised me, to understand their lives, and also to understand our country, frankly, in a time of transition. I chose Houston, and I chose 81, not only because of Reagan and what have you, but just also that Houston seems so incredibly emblematic of the country at that time, and this kind of blind faith and optimism about what the 80s were going to do and what Reagan was going to do. And, you know, they were flush with oil money, and when we meet this character, Jay Porter, he's at a place in his life where he has decided if the political is not going to work for me, maybe there's a different economic American dream for me. Maybe I can get on that train. And that's what starts the book. So I'm going to read from this opening chapter, which is based, and we can talk about some of this when we get into Q&A, which is based on an incident that actually happened in my family. And I think the first chapter really sets up this man's psyche and the mystery and all of this. And then I want to read later some other smaller portions about the two women in his life, one from his past and one from his present. So I'm going to start with chapter 1, Texas, 1981. The boat is smaller than he imagined and dingier. Even at night, Jay can tell it needs a paint job. This is not at all what they discussed. The guy on the phone said moonlight cruise, city lights and all that. Jay had pictured something quaint, something with a little romance, like the riverboats on the Pontchartrain in New Orleans, only smaller. But this thing looks like a doctored-up fishing boat at best. It's flat and wide and ugly, a barge badly overdressed like a big girl invited to her first and probably last school dance. There are Christmas lights draped over every corner of the thing and strung in a line framing the cabin door. So I said, there are Christmas lights draped over every corner of the thing and strung in a line framing the cabin door. They're blinking erratically, somewhat desperately, winking at Jay, promising a good time, wanting him to come on in. Jay stays right where he is, staring at the boat's cabin, 4 leaning walls covered with a cheap carport material. The whole thing looks like it was slapped together as an afterthought, a sloppy attempt at decorum like a hat resting precariously on a drunk's head. Jay looks out across the bayou before him. It is little more than a narrow, muddy strip of water flowing some 30 feet below street level. It snakes through the underbelly of the city, starting to the west and going through downtown, all the way out to the ship channel in the Port of Houston, where it eventually spills out into the Gulf of Mexico. But the view here from Allen's Landing is grim. There are thick, unkempt weeds choked up on the banks of the water, crawling up the cement pilings that hold Main Street overhead. And save for a dim yellow bulb at the foot of a small wooden pier, Allen's Landing is complete blackness. There's a man standing on the boat near the head. He's thin and nearing 70 and wearing an ill-fitting pair of Wranglers. There are tight gray curls poking out of his nylon baseball cap, the words Brotherhood of Longshoremen Local 116, smudged with dirt and grease. He's sucking on the end of a brown cigarette. The old man nods in Jay's direction, tipping the bill of his cap. Jay reaches for his wife's hand. I'm not getting on that thing. She tries to fold her arms across her chest to make the point, but her growing belly is not where it used to be or even where it was last week. Her arms barely reach across the front of her body. Come on, he says. You got the man waiting now. I ain't thinking about that man. Jay tugs on her hand and feels her give just the tiniest bit. Come on. Jay takes her arm, leading her to the edge of the small pier. It sags and creaks beneath their weight. The old man in the baseball cap puts one cowboy boot on a rotted plank of wood that bridges the barge to the pier and flicks his cigarette over the side of the boat. Jay watches it fall into the water, which is black like oil. It's impossible to tell how deep the bayou is, how far to the bottom. Jay squeezes his wife's hand, reluctant to turn her over to the old man, who is reaching a hand over the side of the boat, waiting for Bernie to take her first step. You Jimmy? Jay asks him. No, Jimmy ain't coming. Well, who are you? Jimmy's cousin. Jay nods as if he were expecting this all along, as if being Jimmy's cousin is an acceptable credential for a boat's captain, all the identification a person would ever need. He doesn't want Bernie to see his concern. He doesn't want her to march back to the car. The old man takes Bernie's hand and gently guides her onto the boat's deck, leading her and Jay to the cabin door. He keeps close by Bernie's side, making sure she doesn't trip or miss a step, and Jay feels a sudden, unexpected softness for Jimmy's cousin. He nods at the old man's cap, making small talk. You Union? He asks. The old man shoots a quick glance in Jay's direction, taking in his clean shave, the pressed clothes and dress shoes, and the smooth hands nary a scratch on them. What you know about it? Well, there's a lot Jay knows, more than his clothes explain, but the question here and now is not worth his time. He follows a step or two behind his wife, watching as she pauses at the entrance to the cabin. It's black on the other side, and she waits for Jay to go in first. She doesn't like the dark, he knows. She doesn't like not being in on something. What is this? She whispers. Jay takes another step, feeling along the wall for the switch. When the light finally comes, Bernie lets out a gasp, clutching her chest. Inside the cabin, there are balloons instead of flowers, hot links and brisket instead of filet, and a cooler of beer and grape Shasta instead of wine. It's not much, Jay knows, nothing fancy, but still, it has a certain charm. In the center of the room is a table set for two, a chocolate cake on top. Bernie stares at the cake, the balloons, all of it, a slow smile spreading across her face. She turns to her husband, reaching on her tiptoes for Jay's neck, pressing her cheek to his. She bites his ear, a small, sweet reprimand, a reminder that she doesn't like secrets. The boat's engine starts up and Jay feels the pull of it in his knees. They start a slow coast to the east and out of downtown, beads of water rocking and rolling across the top of the air conditioning unit. The moist, weak stream of air it offers isn't enough to cool an outhouse. The room is only a few degrees below, miserably hot. Jay is already sweating through his dress shirt. Still, he smiles to himself, thinking he's got everything he needs right here. His family, Bernie, and the baby, all he has. There's a sister somewhere, a mother he isn't talking to, old friends he's been avoiding for more than 10 years. He hasn't spoken to his buddies, his comrades, cats from way, way back since his trial, the one that nearly killed him, the one that drove him to law school in the first place. He started skipping meetings after that, skipping funerals, ignoring phone calls, until eventually his friends just stopped calling, until they got the hint. He counts himself lucky, really. A lot of his old friends are dead or locked up or in hiding out of the country somewhere. They are men who cannot come home. But Jay's life was spared by an inch. A single juror, a woman and the only black on the panel. He remembers how she smiled his way every morning of the trial, always with a small nod. "It's okay," the smile said. "I got you, son. I'm not gonna let you fall." After the trial, after he checked himself in and out of St. Joseph's Hospital, he learned the juror, his angel, was a widow who stayed out on Noble Street, down from Bernie's church, the same church where her father, Reverend Boykins, had loaded a bus with half his congregation every morning of Jay's trial. They were women mostly, dressed in their best stockings and felt hats and cat-eye glasses with white rhinestones. They rode to the courthouse every day for 2 weeks simply because they'd heard a young man was in trouble. No questions asked, they'd claimed him as one of their own. They sat through days of FBI testimony, including a secret government tape that was played in the hushed courtroom, a tape of a hasty phone call Jay had made in the spring of 1970. The prosecutors had him on a charge of inciting a riot and conspiracy to commit murder of an agent of the federal government, a kid like him and a paid informant. They had Jay on tape talking to Stokely, a phone call that ran less than 3.5 minutes and sealed his fate. Jay, 19 at the time, sat at the defense table in a borrowed suit, scared out of his mind. His lawyer, appointed by the judge, was a white kid not that much older than Jay. He wouldn't listen and rarely looked at Jay. Instead, he slid a yellow legal pad and a number 2 pencil across the table. Anything Jay had to say, he should write it down. Jay remembers looking around the courtroom every morning and not recognizing a soul. His friends all stayed away, treating his arrest and pending incarceration as something contagious. He was humbled, almost sickened with shame to see the women from the church, women he did not even know, show up every day, taking up the first 2 and 3 rows in the gallery, never speaking or making a scene, just there every time he turned around. "We got you, son. We're not going to let you fall." His own mother hadn't come to the courthouse once, hadn't even come to see him in lockup. He didn't know Bernie then, or her father didn't know the church or God. He was a young man full of ideas that were simple, black and white. He liked to talk big about the coming revolution, about the church Negro who was all show and no action, who was doing nothing for the cause. A word spoken one too many times, worked into one too many speeches until it had lost all meaning for Jay, until it was just a word, a shortcut, a litmus test for picking sides. Well, he's not on anyone's side anymore, except his own. There are other American dreams, he reasons. One is money, of course. A different kind of freedom and seemingly within his reach if he works hard, wears a suit, plays by the new rules. His dreams are simple now: home, his wife, his baby. About an hour into this party, something happens on the boat. He and his wife were standing on the deck. They are about to head back inside when they hear the first scream. What sounds at first like a cat's cry, shrill and desperate. It's coming from the north side of the bayou, high above them, from somewhere in the thick of trees and weeds lining the bank. At first, Jay thinks of an animal caught in the brush, but then he hears it again. He looks at his wife. She, too, is staring through the trees. The old man in the baseball cap suddenly emerges from the captain's cabin. "What the hell was that?" he asks. Jay shakes his head even though he already knows. Somewhere deep down he knows it wasn't an animal he heard, it was a woman. The old man ducks into the main cabin. A few seconds later, Jay hears the music stop and then silence. Nothing except the soft whisper of water lapping against the sides of the boat as they creep slowly along the surface of the bayou. "Y'all heard something?" the old man said. "Over there." Bernie says, pointing to the brush along the embankment. Jay strains to make out any buildings beyond the trees, trying to place where they are. He makes quick calculations, judging their distance from downtown with his eyes, trying to gauge how long they've been drifting westward. But in the darkness and with his drunken sense of time, he can only guess. They're somewhere near Lockwood Drive, near Fifth Ward, that much he can tell. He can see part of the Freedmen's National Bank clock from here. It's late, he realizes, just shy of midnight. He's had a couple of cases come out of Fifth Ward, property disputes and petty theft, but also fistfights and holdups, and one kid who knifed another one just for playing his music too loud. Jay knows they are floating through the backside of one of the roughest neighborhoods in the city. Bernie turns to her husband. Something's wrong out there, Jay. Behind them, there's another scream, a howl, really, a plea. A woman's voice shaped into two very distinct words, help me. Jay feels a slight flutter across his chest, a tiny hiccup of dread. Bernie's voice drops to a whisper, what in the devil is going on out there? The old man disappears into the captain's cabin. A few seconds later, he emerges carrying a flashlight. He shines the weak light into the brush on the north side of the bayou, calling out into the darkness to a face none of them can see. You okay out there? There's no response. The old man waves his light through the trees. They're traveling at an even clip, creeping slowly but surely farther away from her. Hey, you okay out there? A gunshot cracks the air. Jay's heart stops, everything going still. He has a fleeting, panicked thought that this is it. He actually looks down to see if he's been hit, an old habit set off by firecrackers and bad mufflers, a holdover from his other life. There's a second shot, then it echoes and rolls across the air like thunder. God in heaven, the old man says. Bernie mutters a prayer under her breath. Jay grabs for his wife's hand, pulling her toward the door and away from the open deck. Bernie yanks her hand free of his, the movement strong and decisive. She turns to face the old man in the baseball cap. Sir, I think you'd better turn this thing around. I can't, he says to her and Jay. The bayou's too narrow. Besides the basin, ain't no place to turn her around till we get back to Allen's Landing. Then stop the boat, Bernie says. The old man shoots a quick glance in Jay's direction, making it clear that he intends to take no instruction from the pregnant woman, not without her husband's say-so, which only infuriates Bernie. Stop this boat, she says again. In the end, the old man relents, starting on his own for the captain's cabin. Jay grabs his arm. Don't. Somebody's in trouble out there, Jay. There are two people out there, B, he says, the girl and who or whatever it is that she's running from. He's picturing a street fight or a knockdown, drag out between lovers, or something worse, much, much worse. Leave it alone, he hears himself say. Bernie stares at Jay, her voice hushed. What is the matter with you? Her disappointment in him, no matter how it cuts, is not the point. Somebody's shooting out there, B. You got me on this boat, he says, and then pointing to the only other able body on board, a man almost 70, and him and my wife. I, for one, am not willing to put you or myself at risk to step into some trouble we don't know the first thing about. We don't know that girl, don't know what kind of trouble she brings. He says, hearing the cynicism in his voice, hating it, but feeling pressed to speak it anyway. The oldest con in the book, he thinks to himself, is the damsel in distress, the girl with the flat tire by the side of the road, the one with a boyfriend waiting in the weeds to jump you as soon as you stop to help. Just leave it alone. Bernie stares at him for a long, painful moment, squinting around the edges of her eyes as if she's trying to place him, someone she used to know. Oh, Jay. We'll call the police, he says. It's a good plan, clean, simple, logical. The old man is sheepish, slow to move. We ain't got a city license to run this thing after hours. Oh, God, Bernie mumbles. Call the police, man, Jay says. The old man sighs and walks to a dirty white phone that's resting outside the door to the captain's cabin. He lifts the phone, what looks more like a walkie-talkie or CB receiver. Jay and Bernie wait, watching as the old man punches the buttons on the phone a few times. Hearing nothing, he finally slams the receiver in its cradle. The phone, apparently, is not working. Fucking Jimmy, the old man says. There's another scream closer this time. Bernie grabs the flashlight from the old man's hand, swinging the cloudy white light toward the embankment, just as a body drops, rolling zigzag down the steep bank, bumping up against weeds and uneven soil. It rolls all the way down the embankment, and then it disappears. Jay hears a quiet splash, a sucking sound, the bayou swallowing something whole, and then nothing for what seems like an eternity. A moment later, a ripple breaks the still water. Its waves spread like arms offering an embrace. Somebody's moving out there, the captain says. There's a burp and gurgle of air. Something surfaces on the water. Jay hears splashing and then a cry, hoarse and starved for air. Bernie waits for no one's permission. She marches into the captain's cabin. She has to reach past her belly to touch the key sticking out of the control board, turning it to the left. The engine sputters and then falls quiet. No one on the deck moves. No one says a word. Bertie and the old man are both looking at Jay. He moves quickly, without a word being said, removing his watch but not his wedding band, thinking to himself that this is one of those times when being a man, or rather trying to play the part to any convincing degree, trumps his better judgment. He's not exactly a big guy to begin with, and the years have softened his once wiry frame. He kicks off his shoes, then lifts his shirt from his pants, past the slight paunch around his middle. He starts to take it off, but changes his mind. He makes an awkward climb onto the deck's railing, takes a deep breath, holding it tight and precious in his chest, and jumps. This bit from the first chapter is in a lot of ways a metaphor for the larger journey that this character is on, this resistance, this reluctance to get involved in anything, but fundamentally inside being the guy who gets on the railing and jumps in when your wife gives you that look. So throughout this book, this starts off this mystery of who he drug out of this water and what secrets that she's keeping, and he gets tangled up in this big thing. And there's a counter narrative that's going on where there's a union fight in the city, and people who knew Jay back in the day, who he used to be as an activist and who he does not want to be anymore. And he doesn't want to get involved at all, but they ask for one favor: can you call the mayor? The mayor in this book and in real life it was a woman by the name of Kathy Whitmire. She was the first woman mayor ever in the fourth largest city in the country. It took till 1981 to get there, but so that's another way in which Houston was at the vanguard of times that were changing in a lot of ways. So in my book, the first female mayor is a woman named Cynthia. She's a helmet head, right, she's probably a Democrat, but she's a right, far to the right Democrat who kind of came in on Reagan's tails, and she's hidden a lot about her past. And so I'm going to read a little bit from back in the day about how Jay and Cynthia actually really know each other, something that a lot of people in the book don't know. He doesn't remember when he stopped loving her. It would be neat and tidy to say his arrest, those frantic and confused days after he turned himself in, long hours spent in lockup trying to explain to his court-appointed lawyer what exactly had happened, trying to understand it himself, all the while waiting for her to call. He doesn't remember when he stopped loving her or when exactly he started. They never called it anything or gave it a name. In the beginning, she was just a scruffy kid who started coming around to meetings. He was the one who had been appointed to tell her as forcefully as need be to stop. They didn't want her help. Her political awakening was on her own time, not theirs. Besides, in those days, the sisters were still frying chicken and going on beer runs for the meetings, walking 10 feet behind the men at campus marches. If the brothers hadn't run her off, the sisters surely would have. No way a white girl was going to get in line first. He went to tell her in person, even though he didn't have to. He could have waited until she showed up at the next meeting at the duplex on Scott Street, where they spent most of their days organizing marches, skipping classes, eating whatever somebody's little paycheck could scrounge up, drinking beer and fooling around with women whoever's was in the building at the time. He could have waited and made a show of the whole thing, putting down the white girl in front of everybody, but he had no desire to be cruel. She took the news well. After calling him a racist and a chauvinist, a word he had to look up when he got home, she told him she thought he was the only one in his group who had any sense. She asked him if he wanted to join her for dinner, her treat. Jay, who had holes in his coat and was working on a few in the soles of his shoes, was quite grateful for the offer. They went to a barbecue stand on Telephone Road, her choice. She ordered chicken and mustard greens and pushed him toward the hot links and potato salad, since she had never tried those before. And all through dinner, she ran through a laundry list of things she'd been saving up. Stuff she would have said at the meetings if they'd ever let her talk. How they should work the system from the inside. Plant one of their own on the school's admin board, or even better, the city council. Infiltration, she said, chomping on an ice cube soaked in Big Red soda. The FBI ain't all crazy. She thought they could pull it off too, but they would need somebody unassuming, somebody the establishment would never suspect. She licked the corners of her mouth and smiled, an indication that she knew such a person, maybe someone sitting across the table from him right now. You may need me more than you think you do. And she had more to say, too. She claimed their meetings were disorganized, too much eating and smoking, and not enough focus. She also thought that the Panthers were onto something with their uniform look. Have y'all ever thought about getting matching outfits? Something jazzy, like with rainbows on the back? By then, Jay had heard enough. He mumbled something about a paper he had to write. He thanked her for the meal and hitched a ride back on his own. He frankly didn't think he'd ever see her again. But Cynthia Maddox was insatiable and full of ideas. She was on a full scholarship and making straight A's. She had a lot of time on her hands. She stopped coming by the house on Scott Street and started calling him up at his dorm on the hallway phone all time of the night, wanting to run her ideas by him. She was a member of SNCC by then, a group she'd finally talked her way into, and was starting up one of the few SDS chapters in the state. She wanted to know what he thought about this or that. Would he look at a draft of a press release she was writing, urging a boycott of the student union cafeteria? Could she get him to agree to give her a heads up about any marches he had planned so she could coordinate something with her groups and present a unified front to the press? And what did he really think of nonviolence? I mean, really, don't you think we're past all that? Finally, one day, just to shut her up, he asked her where she was from, where she'd gone to high school. She grew up in Katy, she said, out west off the I-10 freeway. She'd come to college late, already in her 20s, and before that, she'd spent her entire life within a 15-mile radius. To Jay, it explained a lot. She was like a spring chicken that had been running around in a too-tight cage and had finally been let loose. Turns out Cynthia didn't know her daddy either. She had a bastard stepfather, too, a guy not even 10 years older than she was, who used to look at her funny when she was coming out of the bathroom. It was weeks before Jay would tell her his own story. The soft footsteps he used to hear in the dark, his stepfather padding past on the way to Jay's sister's room. He'd always hear his mother next, shuffling that same worn carpet in the hallway, walking into her daughter's room to stop whatever had happened or was about to. Jay, who was just a boy then and scared to death of his stepfather, never did a thing to stop him. The next morning, they'd all sit around the breakfast table like nothing had happened, like there wasn't a snake sitting right there at the table, sipping Sanka and sopping up his eggs with a biscuit. His mother was still married to the guy, wondering why Jay never came home for Christmas. He tried to tell his buddies once. He and Bumpy Williams and Lloyd McElvey were sharing a bottle of Jack on the front porch of Bumpy's mother's house in 3rd Ward, one night long after a card game had broken up. Jay tried to talk to them about his family, what tore it up. But his friends weren't interested in personal tragedy. They were out to save a race of people. There was a war going on. This was no time for baby sisters and family squabbles. But Cynthia listened. She said it wasn't his fault. You should call her, she said, meaning his sister. Their phone call started to stretch so long that some of the boys on his floor complained, and he and Cynthia took the meeting off campus. Beer joints and taco stands, sometimes sneaking off to the movies, something he never did with Bumpy or Lloyd. And they hit every blues hall in 3rd Ward. Once they saw Lightnin' Hopkins play at the Pinup Club. Cynthia nearly fainted from the heat, the stench of sweat and perfume, and the shots of hooch she kept accepting from a group of sisters who were having a little fun with her, playing like they were her friends and laying out sly compliments about her stringy hair and laughing at her behind her back. Jay ended up having to drive her home. It was too late to try to sneak her into the girls' dorm, so he drove in circles around town. Cynthia laid across his lap in the front seat of her green Ford truck, waiting on her to sober up. Near dawn, he settled into the parking lot of an elementary school out in the Heights. It was Sunday morning by then, and no one was around. Cynthia came to. She sat up, looked out the window, and asked where they were. Jay had taken off his coat at some point. He'd rolled up his sleeves and was smoking a cigarette out the window. Cynthia turned and looked at him. He can still see her now. Her hair was messed up and tangled, and it was stringy. She had mascara smudged under both of her eyes. Still, she was beautiful, a fact he finally allowed himself to admit, and she was, at that moment, probably the best friend he had. "I like you, Jay," she whispered. He felt something flutter in his stomach, and he was suddenly terribly aware of how hungry he was, how empty he'd been for years. "I like you," she said again. There was no way he would make the first move. She seemed to know this without anything needing to be said. When she finally kissed him, the taste was big and meaty and warm and kind of bitter like blood. He couldn't restrain himself any longer. He put his hands everywhere, cupping her doughy flesh, wanting to fill what he could with her. Before long, they moved to the bed of the truck, lying on top of Jay's ratty coat, his backbone pressed against the metal bed, as she, of course, insisted on being on top. There on his back, eyes stretched past the ponderosa pines to the starlit sky above, Jay held his breath. There were many other times, in the truck, in the basement of her dorm, and once on top of a picnic table after midnight in McGregor Park, one of the stupidest things he's ever done. He never told his friends, and she never told hers. It was just between the two of them. They met in silence most nights, reaching for each other like a salve, slick, wet kisses to wash away everything past the reach of their young arms. By the time the feds killed those boys in Chicago in the winter of '69, everyone was on the lookout for rats. The administration was cracking down. There were cops on campus, cops everywhere, it seemed. The FBI and local law enforcement had moved on to new strategies. They'd grown tired, it seemed, of billy clubs and water hoses. They were just flat out shooting people now. What had started some 15 years earlier with peaceful sit-ins and boycotts had disintegrated into guerrilla warfare. Something ugly was happening. Dark clouds were moving in, marching in martial formation, threatening to break everything wide open. King was dead by then. Malcolm and 2 Kennedys. Death was everywhere. Cynthia asked him once about getting a gun. He feigned ignorance and told her to watch herself. He didn't want her getting hurt. SNCC was falling apart, and Cynthia was spending more and more time trying to get attention for her fledgling SDS chapter, getting deeper and deeper into her own rhetoric, her ideas that they should meet fire with fire. She started speaking around campus more and more, standing on classroom chairs outside the admin building, screaming until her throat was raw, always quoting Malcolm as if the rest of them had never heard of him. She got her name in the school paper, but the Post and the Chronicle mostly ignored her, treating her as little more than a groupie, a white girl caught up in nigger fever, as sure as if the Temptations had come to town. For reasons I will not go into here, Jay and Cynthia don't quite make it. And part of this book is them in the present day trying to navigate the fallout of their romance. Who Jay chooses to spend his life with is another tender story, and I think provides an interesting juxtaposition. This other woman in his life who anchors him as he's trying to heal from all the stuff that he'd been through, his wife. She was just a kid when they met, 13 years old when her father brought her by the courthouse the day the verdict came down. Jay remembers getting dressed that morning, leaving his cell for the last time, either to go home or to the walls in Huntsville. And he remembers the judge's warning there were to be no outbursts in the courtroom, no matter the verdict. Then adding his own 2 cents, the judge said, "I don't have an ounce of respect for you, boy. The Negro issue is one important to this country, but you boys going about it the wrong way, and that's all I'm going to say about it." Jay remembers looking at the jury box at the black lady in particular, the one who stayed down the street from First Love Antioch Baptist Church. She wouldn't look at him. She was in black from head to toe, and she had her head down, hands clasped around a wrinkled handkerchief, her lips moving slowly. She was praying. Jay threw up right there in the courtroom. He managed to get his head between his legs, so most of it spilled out across the floor, black coffee and some chunks of white bread. They'd served him in lockup. Some of the church ladies in the back stood up, so did members of the press. Reverend Boykins was sitting behind Jay with his wife and 2 daughters. He put a hand on Jay's shoulder. Jay remembers turning around. He was shaking his head, trying to say something, ready to make his bargain with God, but he couldn't get any words out. He couldn't speak for days, it would turn out. He was finally out of speeches. The Rev whispered in Jay's ear. He spoke of God and faith. "He's got you, son. He's not going to let you fall." The judge made them all wait until a maintenance crew could be located in the building. They lugged buckets and mops into the courtroom, cleaning up Jay's insides in front of everybody. He was long gone by then, lost in the swamp and stink of his fears, steeling himself against what he thought was inevitable. But the verdict, when it came back, was not guilty. The judge read it twice as if he didn't believe it either. The lady in black, Jay's angel, was weeping. She held her thin, prayerful fingers up to the ceiling, up to the sky, and the Lord on the other side to thank him, as it was clear she didn't trust her vote on a piece of paper. She dabbed her eyes with an eyelet handkerchief. Then, finally, she looked at Jay. Despite the noise in the courtroom, he thought he could hear her heartbeat, soft as a whisper in his ear. She gave him a small nod, just as simple and courteous as if they had passed each other on the street. Jay doesn't remember the faces in the courtroom, doesn't remember meeting the Reverend's family or his future wife. He doesn't remember the parting words from the judge. He looked in the gallery for one face, and when he did not see her, he was ready to go. He walked out of the courtroom with maybe $30 in his pockets and no place to stay. He walked around the city for hours and then days. He spent $6 seeing Beneath the Planet of the Apes twice, eating popcorn for lunch and dinner. He slept in McGregor Park one night. His 3rd day out of jail, he had breakfast at a Wyatt's cafeteria, eggs and coffee. Then he took the bus to St. Joseph's Hospital downtown. When the admitting nurse asked what was bothering him, he wrote down on a piece of paper, "I'm tired." The next time he met Bernadine Boykins, he was in his last year of law school. She was a senior at the University of Houston, a school he hardly recognized anymore. He'd seen Bernie around the church, times he went by to pay respects to her father. He thought she was cute, but just a kid. In truth, Evelyn, Bernie's sister, was probably at the time more to his liking. I'm sorry, did I establish that they had brought him over for the Reverend's family had brought them over for dinner one night, trying to set him up with the older girl. But 5 minutes into the meal, Jay knew he could never make it with Evelyn, who was pouting about the heat, pouting about her hips. Couldn't someone pass her a better piece of chicken? After dinner, he took a cigarette on the porch, and Bernie brought him a glass of tea, floating a slice of lemon on top. She sat on the porch steps, pushing her skirt between her knees, and asked him if he'd ever seen Cooley High, what kind of music he liked, and if he'd ever been roller skating. And then she asked if he'd like to go out with her sometime. "I've had a crush on you since I was 13 years old," she said. He couldn't explain even then why this moment grabbed him so, why it hit him at the knees. It was about the sweetest thing he'd ever heard, offered up with such sincerity, such simplicity. She was nearly 20 by then and shapely, with soft brown eyes and a heart-shaped face that looked up at him, waiting for some answer. He told her he'd have to ask her father, and she laughed out loud, showing her long white teeth. They dated on and off that summer. She was answering phones at a dental office on the north side of town. He had a car by then and would pick her up sometimes when she got off work. They went to the movies mostly, held hands in the dark. She helped him study for the bar exam, made up flashcards, even though she didn't understand half the terms she was writing on them. And a couple of months into his first job handling traffic tickets and DWIs at a low-rent shop across from the municipal courthouse, Bernie told him to go out on his own if he hated the job so much. "Do your thing," she said. He got to thinking that he loved her. She held him up in ways he never expected from a woman, so he married her. She moved into his small one-bedroom apartment and never once complained. She loved him in an uncomplicated way, not at all weighed down by false expectations. She seemed to understand the limits of his emotional fluency, the things he simply could not or would not talk about. It was a good fit for him. So much had changed in the world in so few years. They were almost of 2 generations, though he was only 7 years older than she was. With Bernie, he could start new. He went along with her friends, made do without any of his own, and over the years they made a pact, unspoken but as real and present in their marriage as the furniture in their apartment, the bed they slept on every night. She didn't ask questions about his trial, where he got those guns, why they never saw his mother at Christmas or Thanksgiving. But lately, the baby coming and all, she seems to want something more from him. He can't bear to disappoint her, but he won't be pushed into places he's not willing to go. That was never a part of the deal. And then I'll just read one last thing, if you guys will lovingly indulge me. And I hope it's a hopeful note. Jay gets himself in a lot of trouble in this book, and towards the end finds himself in the first chapter. Why he makes choices that he makes is because he never wants to end up in a jail cell again, ever. And by the end, he finds himself back there. He said he would never be back here. Behind bars an inch thick, his feet aching on a filthy linoleum floor, a pool of urine in one corner, dried vomit in another, men sleeping on the floor like dogs, no place to relieve himself with dignity, no place even to set himself down so he can think straight. 10 paces by 15. He's lived his whole life in this cell, it seems. Lived in fear of it at least, which it turns out is exactly the same thing as being in the sweat and shit of it, the I can hardly breathe of it. The stench in this place, the way the walls start to pinch at his insides, it's never left him. He's spent the last 10 years right here on lockdown. Keep your fucking mouth shut. Isn't that the law he's lived by? Keep your mouth shut, speak only when spoken to. And what good did it do him? The silence. The freedom he marched for a lifetime ago, the speeches he made, the dreams he had, what good was any of it really if he can't get free in his own mind? So he can eat at a lunch counter, drink warm water from a fountain, and he can vote. So what now? Jay is not a praying man, not really, but some moments in a man's life beg for a little magic, a faith beyond what the eyes can see. The morning his verdict came down, he prayed alone in a cell smaller than this one. They kept the lights on 24 hours a day. The cell was drenched in white light and hot, not a comforting shadow in sight. He got on his knees next to the bed, elbows on a mattress so thin it looked like somebody had laid a cracker across the springs. He closed his eyes and he tried to picture God the way other people did, as a father, one who might watch out for him, lay a comforting hand. He carried that picture in his head and into the courtroom that day, and he made a bargain with God. You cut me loose. Set me free out of this mess I'm in, and I'll lay it down, he said. It was a promise to walk away from the armed rhetoric, from the political shitstorm he was forever stirring, from a way of life that had consumed him. It was a promise to lay his voice down, to silence himself, which turned out not to be freedom at all, not even nowhere close. And standing now in a urine-stained corner of this jail cell, where he paid a toll of 6 cigarettes to be left in peace, he strikes a new bargain with himself. There is a way out of here, he knows, out of this prison in his mind. It requires only the courage to speak. Thank you.